So,
And
I'm Rashia. I'm the founder of the Painted Lady Foundation. And thank you so much for agreeing to do the interview for the
of
Painted
course,
Lady Foundation. It's really appreciated, and I'm sure the people watching this interview afterwards will really gain a lot from it. So, as you know, Painted Lady Foundation aims to fiercely combat the issue of sexual assault and sexual harassment. And seeing your content on Instagram and on YouTube, and even listening to your amazing debut EP, um, Double Standards, I thought you'd be the best person to have a conversation with regarding the issue at hand, and considering all your initiatives to empower women and the youth of our today. So yeah.
thank you for
So,
having me here and for the amazing work that y'all do.
yeah.
It sounds absolutely incredible.
Thank you. So I'll just start. Um, um, so my first question was really, to what extent do you think the issue of sexual assault and sexual harassment is an impediment to gender inequality? Oh, equality.
In a massive way, because disproportionately heterosexual men do not receive the kinds, firstly, are not assaulted as much as other people of other genders are, but also do not receive the kinds of threats that people do, right? It's not just about um, harassment and an assault is absolutely not okay in any situation. It defies all aspects of humanity, goes against everything we know with regard to consent and body, and it's often a sign of power. But what's scary is that that even extends to the threats that we make to other people, right? Often, whether it's on the internet or even in person, people will make threats to other folks in the form of something phallic or oriented towards sexual assault. And more often than not, that's geared toward non-heterosexual men, most often women and folks of other genders, in a massive way. If somebody is upset with somebody, they will, often do empty threats of doing some sort of bodily harm in the form of sexual assault to them. And if they are attacking, say, a heterosexual man, most often they will say that they will do something to their mothers, sisters, wives,
Yeah.
partners. Um, and the fact that we think that's okay is insane to me,
Yeah.
and it disproportionately um, just goes to show how we as a society still have this idea of power seated in our, for lack of a better word,
Yeah.
phallic areas, and for a lot of people, um, even the use of language, right? When we talk about things, for example, if as a young person, if you call somebody a pussy, right, what you are doing by result is saying that the pussy, which is meant to denote like the, female genitalia in some capacity, is weaker than, less than, and we use all of these phallic words from such a young age that it only extends into that. And I just say this because assault is, the fact that in some parts it's normalized comes from this deep cultural conditioning that we have around all the precursor language to that.
I think I'm actually glad you kind of brought up the entire aspect of like language use and even power, because that's something that growing up now, like it's kind of hitting me now. I've been slowly realizing that it's kind of very enrooted in even something as basic as our language. And yeah, it's like the entirety of power, and it extends way more than just um, gender and equality and inequality, and it goes all the way to power. So yeah, I'm glad you kind of brought that up.
Of
Um,
course.
so also, just kind of moving on to the next question. Do you know of any myths or misconceptions that you've heard about regarding sexual assault and sexual harassment? And if so, what are they? Like, for instance, in terms of consent, right? People think that, well, it can be revoked either before a sexual act or an activity takes place and after. But something I've realized while just talking to people is that they don't realize that it can actually be taken away at any point or given at any point in time during a sexual activity itself. So just something like that that you may know of.
Yeah, of course. I mean, consent is dynamic, right? And it always has to be an enthusiastic yes or it's a no. And obviously, I understand that for a lot of folks, that's a hard concept to wrap their minds around, because for many people, they're like, okay, then I can't do anything. But it's not about, if you decide to be intimate with somebody, it's all about comfort for both parties, right? And if it's in a situation where people don't know each other and there's any form of coercion involved, that is assault or harassment. It doesn't matter what the situation is. A lot of people think that like just simple things that people don't often realize, when you and when anybody, either party, is intoxicated, that is not okay, and that does not mean consent can be freely given, right? A lot of people, when it comes to myths, most people think that men can't be assaulted or harassed, and that is absolutely not true, right? A lot of the stories we hear are of women or people of other genders being harassed, but straight men can also be harassed, and often that's brushed under the carpet and not talked about. For me, can you hear me?
I'm so sorry. I think the Wi-Fi cut out for a second. It's okay.
No, that's okay.
I can hear you
That's
now.
okay. Okay. I was just saying that often, if a situation of harassment or assault happens, to men, many of them don't even report it, or many of them don't even talk about it because they feel like their manhood has been taken
Yeah.
away, right? And again, it just goes back to that situation of power. The other thing is, we often, when people share their harassment or assault stories, we often preface it by saying, well, at least nothing major happened.
I've noticed that.
Any form of, it is not okay to catcall somebody in a lewd manner. It is not okay to look at somebody in a lewd manner. It's not okay to touch somebody without their consent, no matter where it is, right? I know so many people are like, yeah, they touched me inappropriately, but at least they didn't rape me. I'm like, excuse me.
Yeah,
You know, there are degrees and none of them are okay.
yeah, yeah. That's true. I've realized that, when I kind of watch story times on YouTube about people's stories, I realized that in the comments, people will kind of talk about their experiences, but then they'll often use that kind of term that at least it's not as bad as yours, but it's
No.
important to give importance to your story as well, no matter what happened. Yeah. Um, so I'm glad you kind of even brought up like the cat calling aspect because it kind of correlates to the next question I was going to ask you. So in terms of like eve teasing, that classifies as sexual harassment, and with your experience in living in different parts of the world, such as the U.S. or India, how often have you seen an instance of eve teasing or something related happening to either like just in general like people or yourself? And yeah,
Unfortunately, more often than not.
yeah,
And it often happens in situations that perpetuate certain stereotypes, right? So it happens often when there aren't other people around, and so the person feels more comfortable. Happens often later at night, and unfortunately, that then just feeds into and perpetuates the fact, or you know, this idea that it's not safe for a woman to go out after a certain time, right? Walking in a certain place, like, why should I or anybody else feel unsafe walking down a street?
yeah.
Just absolutely why, right? For existing, regardless of what you're wearing, and it has nothing to do with any of these factors, for existing and being of a particular gender, why is it okay for other people to do that? Absolutely not, right? And you see it happen, and it's a hard one whether you call it out or not, right? Because often what happens when it's happened to me or people that I know, often I will see it, and you ignore, because sometimes you know that if you give attention to it, either it could, cause more problems for you, or that's exactly what they want, which is why they're doing it. Um, but if we don't call it out collectively, then people just think it's okay. And I think that a lot of this comes from deep rooted conditioning from a very young age, right? Obviously, it's been more accepted in society, and there is certain spaces where it happens more prevalently than not. But if from a young age we are socialized to think that, if young men are socialized to think that women are less than, women are weaker, what they wear is a sign of their moral character. It's okay to, and then you see in pop culture this happens so much, and of course pop culture most often is fiction, but a lot of people get impacted by it, right? So if there are very popular films or TV shows or music that is talking about things and essentially um, insinuating calling out baby girl like that, or like, you know what I mean?
I
It
do.
just feeds into that and makes people feel like it's okay.
Yeah, yeah. There's many like subtle ways that kind of play into making people feel that it's okay to do what they're doing. Yeah, I get
Yeah.
that. Um, so I guess to kind of just answer the next question, I was going to ask you what do you think are some of the causative factors as to like as what leads to like things like increase and stuff like that. And I guess you kind of touched on that already. Um, just moving on. I think you also kind of mentioned, this deep, deep-rooted conditioning from a young age. So just in terms of that, at what level or age do you think young children should be exposed to this issue to better their understanding, and even as a preventative measure? And to what degree do you think that they should be exposed to this issue of pain?
I think at every level, right? I think that, for example, our idea of sex education or social education should start very young. And I say very young at the age of 2. Now, obviously, a 2-year-old does not necessarily need to know the mechanisms of sex, but a 2-year-old can understand the difference between good touch and bad touch,
Yeah,
right? A
yeah,
5-year-old can understand and be able to name the parts of their body, like they're able to name their forehead, knees, toes. They should be able to name their vagina and penis and understand that perhaps those are more private places in the fact that other people can't access them, but they are not shameful,
yeah,
right? A 5 to 8-year-old understands consent, and that responsibility and autonomy should be afforded to them. There's so many situations in which, a family member or a family friend or somebody will come over and they'll be like, oh, please give them a hug or give them a kiss. And if the child does not feel comfortable, they should be given the autonomy to say no, right? And it starts early. It's just small ways in which we constantly understand that. And if you talk to, for unfortunately, news about this is everywhere. And we've seen assault cases happening to children as young as 6 months. Like, it's just insane. And so if we're not educated about um, our own bodies and how they are our own and our own right to share them with another human being or not, we won't have that understanding, right? I had a harassment experience with a teacher when I was 11, and I had never had those conversations with adults in my life, and so I thought that I was doing something wrong when they were touching me inappropriately, right? And it took me years to be able to talk to my parents about it.
mhm,
And I still came from a sense and place of privilege where I at least understood the mechanisms of the biological aspects of sex by that point. But it's not just about that, right? It's about all the other social factors. It's about the gender roles we ascribe, right, to children from a young age, and it starts so small. I I spoke to um, I spoke to a few children recently, I think ages 10 to 13,
mhm,
who came from mid to low socioeconomic backgrounds. And I asked them if they had heard the word rape before. And many of them said yes. So I asked them what it meant. And many of them, basically in Hindi, they said, Uska matlab hai koi ehsan kar raha hai, which means that somebody is forcefully doing something to you.
yeah,
And and I was like, okay, what do you mean? And all they know is that it's a forceful act, but they don't necessarily know beyond that, right? But they have the knowledge that somebody's forcing themselves upon them. Um, and so if you're not prepared in a situation where the forcefulness is not okay to be of somebody's touch or phallic areas or absolutely anything, right? It'll come to you as a surprise, and often when it happens, there's so much shock and there's so much sense of a violation that we don't even have language with which to describe it.
yeah.
So being able to put language to it to say what's not okay is just so important. I mean, I just think that there's there should be no shortage of talking about it.
No, I get that. 100%. Yeah, what you're saying is makes complete sense. Um, so uh, just kind of taking that further a little bit. Um, this issue is obviously prevalent in kind of all parts of the world. But let's just, if I was to just pick a country, let's just say India, for instance, right? Where do you see progress in fighting this issue, and where do you still see some rooms of improvement?
I think progress is happening more with initiatives like yours and with many other people, particularly young folks, being um, aware and empowering each other to talk about it. Number one, awareness, right? Number two, like talking about it. It's so important. It's very underrated, the importance of conversation around this. But the more we talk about it, the more A, people feel comfortable sharing their own stories and realizing that they're not alone.
Yeah.
And B, just recognizing that this is a phenomenon that is happening in this world and it's absolutely not okay. And we all need to rally together toward it, right? Um, I think that in terms of progress, there are laws that are, being drafted and that have been incorporated over the last decade that are helping combat, these situations. I think that there is starting to be more awareness, at least at the youth level, about what things are, and sometimes even if it's a single day, there's often these talks happening in schools. But it can't be just a single day, like I've done my duty, absolve myself of this. It
Yeah.
needs to be constant conversation. So that's where progress happens, right? And I think progress happens in so many different ways, at the legal level, at the policy level, at the accountability level. But I'm a firm believer that so much of this is coming from just deep rooted conditioning, and that can be nipped in the bud at the early stages of your development. And so, schools, homes, peer situations become spaces in which we can start to see more progress. And something as simple as sometimes people will make jokes about things, right? And they'll make jokes because it's been okay for them to make jokes about things, but so often you'll find jokes about people, like people will make assault jokes or people will make
Yeah.
harassment jokes, which are absolutely not okay, right? So in just even simple situations, calling something like that out is important. And I think these conversations not necessarily happening in a, for lack of a better word, activist manner, because I think what tends to happen with a lot of people is they feel like somebody's preaching to them and they're like, oh, I've heard this, I don't need to deal with this, rather than it just being a casual conversation. So if you see somebody making a joke, calling them out by being like, that's absolutely wrong, you cannot do this, you are a bad person, is not going to help them, because they're just going to associate that with you and anger,
Yeah.
rather than being like, hey, so just like what you said, just like curious why you said it, and then just like unpacking. Often people will realize that they haven't even realized why they're saying it or where that's coming from, right?
And that makes a lot of sense. And I guess you again kind of just touched upon what I was going to ask you next in terms of what the youth they could do to
Yeah.
help at this issue. And yeah, that makes total sense. Just even noticing the subtle signs, just noticing the smallest things around you, and yeah, that makes complete sense. So that's about it. Those are kind of all of my questions. Is there anything else that Oh, sorry, there's some Wi-Fi cut. Is there anything else that you'd like to bring up or highlight or anything at all?
Um, I just think that it's so important to keep talking about this, and it's so important um, to have initiatives like this. So huge kudos to you and the whole foundation
Thank
for the
you.
work that you're doing. And it is absolutely okay to speak up. And if you have been and dealt with anything, even if it was 10 years ago, that is okay. Talking about it will lift that huge load off of your chest that you've likely been carrying around. Um, Noticing others' situations around you and just advocating for people's safety is so important. And it's so minor, but it makes a world of a difference. And I just think that, the more we have conversation around this, the more we have safe spaces, right? So in our institutions, in our peer circles, and whatever that is, just having safe spaces to have these conversations, having access to resources, right? So, for example, if somebody is interested in, say, going into counseling or studying psychology or social work or something of that nature, also recognizing that there are spaces where you can specialize in domestic violence and sexual assault, things of that nature, and finding resources like that around you is so important, because the more resources we have access to, the more safe we feel to be able to share that.
No, so thank you so much for that. um, so it was again like it was super interesting and super great to have this conversation with you, and I'm sure it would be of great value to other people as well.
I'm
Yeah,
glad. I hope it was helpful. And thank you so much for having me. And thank you for all the incredible work that you do.
of course. Thank you so much. Bye.
Of course.